The cane was still trembling in the air when Nathaniel understood what he had seen, and the understanding arrived a full breath too late to stop it. The blow had already fallen. It had not fallen upon the boy. A woman stood where the boy had been, her shoulder turned into the stroke, her arm flung back to gather the child against her skirts, and in the great cold hall of Blackmere the only sound was the hiss of her indrawn breath, and then a silence so complete that the Duke could hear the fire settling in the grate behind him. He had come through the door without being announced. That was his habit in his own house, to arrive unseen, to observe men when they believed themselves unobserved, for a man revealed his true nature only when he thought no master's eye was on him. He had meant to cross the corridor to his study. He had heard, instead, the flat crack of ash against cloth, and Mr. Kroll's voice rising in that dry, correcting cadence that Nathaniel had permitted in his household without ever once troubling to listen to it. And he had turned into the schoolroom doorway in time to see the second stroke descend, and a plain gray figure step into its path, as though stepping into rain. She did not cry out. That was the thing that held him fixed upon the threshold, his hand still on the cold brass of the door. A cry he could have dismissed. A cry would have been a servant's noise, a thing to be quieted and forgotten. But she had taken the blow across the back of her shoulder and made no sound at all beyond that first sharp breath, and now she stood very straight with the boy's face hidden in her apron, and she looked at Mr. Kroll with an expression Nathaniel had not seen turned upon any man in his hall in a great many years. She was not afraid. She was appalled, which was a different and far more dangerous thing, and she was appalled on another's behalf, which was a thing the Duke of Blackmere had schooled himself to believe no longer existed in the world. Mr. Kroll had not yet seen his master. His arm was still lifted, the cane poised, his long sallow face flushed with the particular satisfaction of a man interrupted in the exercise of his authority. "Stand aside, Miss Thorne," he said. "You forget yourself. The boy was insolent and the boy will be corrected. That is the whole of my commission in this house, and I will thank you not to. You will not strike this child again." Her voice was low, it did not shake, "not while I am able to stand between." "You are a governess," said Mr. Kroll, "not a magistrate." "Then dismiss me," she said, "but you will do it without the cane in your hand." Nathaniel watched the tutor's mouth open upon some further sentence, and he watched the man's eyes travel past the woman's shoulder and find, at last, the tall figure in the doorway. He watched the color go out of Mr. Kroll's face the way water goes out of a cracked glass, all at once and from the bottom. The cane came down, not upon anyone. It came down to the man's side and hung there, and Mr. Kroll drew himself up and produced a bow that was too deep and too quick to be anything but the reflex of a frightened man. "Your Grace," he said, "I did not, that is, I was not aware." "No," said Nathaniel, "you were not." He had a voice that he had spent 15 years making into an instrument, low and even and entirely without heat, and he had learned that it did more work upon a room than shouting ever had, because men could brace themselves against anger, but they could not brace themselves against a cold that seemed to have no bottom. He used it now. He said nothing more than those two words, and Mr. Kroll flinched as though he had been struck in his turn. The woman had turned when the Duke spoke. She had turned and she had seen him, and for the space of a heartbeat her composure faltered, not into fear, he noted, but into something like calculation, the swift reckoning of a person who has just discovered that the audience for her defiance is larger and more consequential than she had supposed. Then she gathered the child more firmly against her and inclined her head, and she said, "Your Grace," in a voice that was steady again, and Nathaniel found that he was looking at her face and that he had, for one unguarded instant, forgotten what he had intended to say. She was young. He had known there was a new governess in the house. His steward attended to such engagements and did not trouble him with them, and Nathaniel had signed whatever paper had been put before him and given the matter no further thought. He had imagined, insofar as he had imagined anything, a woman of the usual kind, thin, gray, grateful, invisible. This woman was none of those things. She was perhaps 25. Her face was pale now with pain that she was refusing to show, and there was a strand of dark hair come loose across her cheek, and her eyes, when they met his, did not drop the way a servant's eyes ought to drop before the Duke of Blackmere. They held. They held with a kind of exhausted honesty, as though she were too tired and too angry to perform the deference that her station required, and beneath the anger he saw that she was in pain, real pain, and that she was ashamed of nothing. "Miss Thorne," he said. "Yes, your grace." "You are hurt." It was not the sentence he had meant to speak. He had meant to say something to Mr. Kroll, some cold instruction that would restore the ordinary machinery of the house, and permit him to go on to his study, and his letters and his brandy, and his long gray evening. Instead, he had said that she was hurt, and he heard the words as though another man had spoken them, and he saw the small, startled shift in her face that told him she had not expected the Duke of Blackmere to remark upon it either. "It is nothing, your grace," she said. "It is not nothing." He came into the room. He was aware of Mr. Kroll shrinking against the schoolroom wall, and he was aware, more distantly, of the boy Thomas, his brother's son, 6 years old and small for it, his face still buried in the governess's apron, and his thin shoulders shaking. Nathaniel did not look at the boy. He had made it a rule not to look at the boy, and the rule had cost him something to make and cost him a little more to keep each day, and he kept it now because keeping it was the only thing in the room that felt like solid ground. "Let me see," he said to the woman. She hesitated. Then she drew the child gently to one side, murmuring something to him too low for the Duke to hear, and she turned her shoulder, and Nathaniel saw the mark. The blow had caught her across the top of the back where the gray wool of her gown was thin over the bone. The cloth was not torn. Kroll was a coward and had not swung with his full strength, or the angle had spared her the worst of it, but a red wheal was already rising through the weave, and when Nathaniel looked at it, something moved in his chest that he had believed long dead, a slow cold turning like ice breaking somewhere far under a frozen river where no one could see it break. "Mr. Kroll," he said, and he did not raise his voice at all. "Your grace, I must protest that the boy—" "You will be silent." The tutor was silent. Nathaniel did not look at him. He was looking still at the mark on the governess's shoulder, and he found that he was holding himself very still because if he moved he was not certain what he would do, and the Duke of Blackmere did not do things of which he was uncertain. "You were engaged in this house," he said, "to instruct a child in his letters and his figures and his catechism. You were not engaged to lay a cane across the back of anyone under this roof. Least of all a woman who was doing the duty you were too small a man to do, which is to say, protecting a defenseless creature from harm. The boy is willful, your grace. He requires, said Nathaniel, that you leave his presence and do not return to it. Go to the steward's room, wait there. You will not touch that cane again while you remain in my house, and you will not remain in it long." He turned his head at last and looked at the man, and he saw Mr. Kroll understand all at once that he had made a mistake whose full extent he could not yet measure. "Go," said the Duke. The tutor went. He set the cane down upon the schoolroom table with exaggerated care, as though setting it down gently might undo the use to which he had put it, and he bowed twice more and backed toward the door and was gone, and the sound of his footsteps hurried away down the stone corridor and left the three of them alone in the schoolroom with the fire. Nathaniel became aware of the fire. It was a small fire, mean for so large a room, and he thought with a distant flicker of displeasure that the schoolroom was cold, that no one had thought to keep it warm, that the boy had been sitting in this gray cold room being caned by a hired man, while the Duke of Blackmere sat 2 doors away with a good fire and a decanter, and never once wondered what was done in his own house in his own name. It was not a comfortable thought. He put it aside, as he had learned to put aside all thoughts that were not comfortable, and he found that this one would not go entirely, that it lodged somewhere and stayed. "Sit down, Miss Thorne," he said. "Your grace, I am quite able to." "Sit down." She sat. She did it stiffly, and he saw the pain move across her face as she lowered herself onto the schoolroom bench, and he saw her master it. The boy climbed onto the bench beside her at once and pressed himself into her side, and this time Nathaniel could not help but see him, the small pale face, the wet eyes, the way the child looked up at the woman as though she were the only warm thing in a house made all of stone. It was his brother's face. It had always been his brother's face, and that was the whole of the trouble. That was why Nathaniel did not look. He looked now. Edmund's chin, Edmund's grave gray eyes, Edmund's way of holding very still when he was frightened, as though stillness might make him too small to be seen. The Duke felt the old grief turn over in him like a stone in deep water, and he mastered it as he mastered everything, and he addressed himself to the child because the child was easier just then than the woman. "He has hurt you," Nathaniel said to the boy. It was not a question. Before today, this was not the first time. The boy said nothing. He looked up at the governess, and she put her arm about him, wincing as she did it, and she said quietly, "You may tell His Grace the truth, Thomas. No harm will come to you for it. I promise you that." And Nathaniel heard her make the promise, and he heard the certainty in it, and it occurred to him with a strange cold shock that she had no authority whatever to make such a promise, that she was a governess, engaged for a wage, dependent for her very bread upon the goodwill of a man who could dismiss her with a word, and that she had made it anyway, staked her word upon it, as though her word were a wall she could set between the child and the world, as though she believed her word would hold. The boy nodded. Once. He did not speak, but he nodded, and that was answer enough, and Nathaniel felt the ice turn over again, farther down this time, in a place he did not care to examine. "Thank you," said the Duke gravely, as though the boy had spoken. "You have been braver than most men I have known." He straightened. He could not remain in this room. He had reached the limit of what he could feel and still keep his face in order, and keeping his face in order was the labor of his life. "Miss Thorne, you will go to the housekeeper. Mrs. Ashe will attend to your shoulder. She has a hand for such things and a store of arnica, I believe. You will not return to your duties today." "The boy will remain with me until I have—" He stopped. He had not intended to say that either. "The boy will remain with me." He had not kept the boy with him for a single hour since the child had come to Blackmere 7 months before. He had housed him and clothed him and hired men to teach him, and had otherwise arranged his life, so that he need not see the small grave face that was his dead brother's face. "Until I have made other arrangements for his care," he finished, which was true and was not what he had begun to say, and he saw the governess look at him with those steady, exhausted eyes, as though she had heard the sentence he had not finished as clearly as the one he had. "Your Grace," she said, "may I ask you something?" No one asked the Duke of Blackmere things. It was not done. His steward brought him matters for decision. His solicitor brought him papers. The county brought him its deference and its dread, and behind its hands, its stories of the cold Duke of Blackmere who had frozen his own brother out of the house and into an early grave. No one asked him anything, because to ask was to presume upon a nearness that Nathaniel permitted no one, and he had made himself, over 15 careful years, into a man of whom nothing was asked. "You may ask," he said. "When you say other arrangements." She had risen from the bench despite his instruction, one hand pressed to the boy's shoulder, and she stood before him with her chin level and her voice quiet and would not look away. "You do not mean to send him from Blackmere. You do not mean to send him somewhere I cannot, somewhere he will be alone again, among strangers, with another Mr. Kroll. That is a great deal to read into 3 words, Miss Thorne." "It is a great deal to fear, Your Grace, for a child who has no one." She said it simply. There was no insolence in it, though the words themselves were nearly insolent. There was only the plainness of a person telling the truth because the truth mattered more to her than her place. "Forgive me. I have overstepped. I know that I have. But he has no one but me to speak for him, and I have found that when there is no one to speak for a person, the kindest silence in the world will let him be carried off. So I will overstep, and you may dismiss me for it if you choose, but I will have said it. Do not send him away to be broken. He is not willful. He is grieving. There is a difference, and no one in this house has troubled to learn it." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. He was aware that he ought to be angry. A governess had contradicted him in his own schoolroom, had presumed to instruct him upon the character of a child of his own blood, had implied no, had stated that no one in his house, which meant, first and last, its master, had troubled to know that his brother's orphaned son was grieving. It was an impertinence for which he would have turned any other servant out of doors before nightfall. He waited for the anger to come, because the anger was familiar and the anger was safe, and the anger would put this too honest woman back in her place, and let him close the door of the schoolroom and the door of himself and go on. The anger did not come. What came instead was the memory of the cane trembling in the air, and the woman stepping into its path without a sound, and the boy's face hidden in her apron. And beneath that older, the memory of another schoolroom in this same cold house, 30 years gone, and another cane, and a boy who had learned that the surest way to survive the Duke of Blackmere was to feel nothing that could be seen. And the Duke of Blackmere, who was that boy grown, looked at Frances Thorne standing wounded and unbowed with his brother's son under her hand, and he did not dismiss her. "You have not overstepped," he said, and the words cost him something, and he let them cost it. "You have said a true thing that no one else in this house was honest enough or brave enough to say. I will not forget that you said it. Go now to Mrs. Ashe. The boy stays with me," and Miss Thorne, she had turned toward the door, she turned back. "You will not be dismissed, not today and not for this. You have my word." He saw the surprise move across her face, and something behind the surprise that he could not name and did not let himself examine, and she said, "Thank you, your grace." And she went, one hand still pressed to her wounded shoulder, and at the door she paused and looked back, not at him, at the boy, and gave the child a small steadying smile that transformed her whole tired face, and then she was gone. Nathaniel stood alone in the cold schoolroom with his brother's son, and the fire settled, and he did not know what to say to a child, having spent 15 years making certain he would never have to learn. The boy sat on the bench with his hands folded in his lap and watched the Duke the way a small creature watches a large one, without moving, judging the distance to the door. Nathaniel had commanded armies of servants, had faced down men in the lords who would have ruined him, had stood over his father's coffin without a tremor, while the county waited to see whether the cold Duke would weep for the man who had made him cold, and had given them nothing. He had not, in all of that, ever felt so thoroughly at a loss as he felt now, standing in a chill schoolroom before a child of 6 who would not speak. "You need not be afraid of me," he said, and heard how the words rang false in that room, for every soul at Blackmere was afraid of him, and he had built it so on purpose. "Mr. Kroll will not return." The boy said nothing. "Do you know who I am?" A nod, grave, unsurprised. "Say it then. A man should be able to name the person he speaks to." The child's voice, when it came, was very small and very clear. "You are my uncle. You are the Duke." Yes, Nathaniel found he had to steady himself against the plain fact of being named. My uncle. No one had called him that. The boy had lived 7 months under his roof, and they had exchanged in all that time perhaps a dozen sentences, always at Nathaniel's arranging and always brief, and the Duke had contrived it so precisely because of this, because the word uncle in the boy's mouth undid something he had spent 15 years tying shut. "I am your uncle," he said. "Your father was my brother, Edmund." Something crossed the small face. "I don't remember him." "No, you would have been very young. 2 years old when Edmund died, in a rented room in a foreign city, of a fever and of poverty, and Nathaniel had always privately believed, of a grief that had begun in this house 30 years before and never once let its grip loosen. The boy would not remember his father. That was a mercy, and it was also the cruelest thing about the whole affair, that Edmund had gone out of the world leaving behind a son who could not even mourn him because he had never had time to know his face. "You have his look," Nathaniel said. "About the eyes. I will tell you of him one day if you should like to hear it." The boy considered this with a seriousness that was, again, exactly Edmund's, and then he said, "Will Miss Thorne be sent away?" He did not ask whether his uncle would tell him of his father. He did not ask whether he himself was safe. He asked whether Miss Thorne would be sent away. The whole of the child's care was for the woman who had stepped in front of the cane, and Nathaniel understood, looking at that anxious little face, that Frances Thorne had in 7 weeks. The steward's ledger would give him the exact figure later become the single fixed point of the boy's world, the one warm certain thing, and that the child's first and greatest fear was not for his own skin but for hers. "No," said Nathaniel, "she will not be sent away. I have given her my word, and I give it now to you also. Miss Thorne stays." The boy let out a breath that seemed too large for so small a body, and his shoulders came down from about his ears, and for the first time he looked at the Duke not as one watches a large, dangerous animal, but as a child looks at a grown man who has just said the one thing he needed to hear. It was not trust. It was the barest first possibility of trust, the width of a hair, and Nathaniel felt it settle upon him like a weight he had not asked to carry and could not now set down. He rang for a servant and had the boy taken to the kitchen, where it was warm and where cook, he happened to know, was soft in a way the rest of the house was not, and would give the child bread and dripping, and let him sit by the great range. Then he went to his study, and he did not, as he had intended when the day began, attend to his letters. He stood at the tall window and looked out over the park, gray under a gray sky, the avenue of limes bare and dripping, the long sweep of grass running down to the ornamental water that his grandfather had made and his father had let go to weed. Blackmere, 3,000 acres, a house of 90 rooms, a name that had been a byword in the county for 4 generations, first for pride, then for hardness, and now in his own tenure for cold. The cold Duke. He knew what they called him. He had made no effort to be called anything else. There was a safety in cold that no other quality afforded a man. The cold man was never surprised, never wounded, never made a fool of by his own heart, because he had put his heart somewhere it could not be reached and thrown away the map. Nathaniel had done that at 12 years old, on the day his father had caned Edmund insensible for weeping at their mother's funeral. For the crime of weeping. A boy of 9 weeping for his dead mother, and Nathaniel, standing rigid and dry-eyed at his father's side, had understood in a single blaze of terrible clarity that feeling was a door through which pain entered, and that a man who wished to survive the Duke of Blackmere must brick that door up and never open it again. He had bricked it up. He had done it so well that when his father died at last, unlamented, Nathaniel had felt nothing but a distant administrative relief, as at the settling of a tedious account. He had done it so well that when Edmund, gentle, unbricked, hopeful Edmund, who had never learned the trick of it, had quarreled with him over the very estate and gone abroad with his young wife and his debts and his open bleeding heart, Nathaniel had let him go with a cold word and a colder silence, and had told himself it was for the best, and had gone on being the Duke. He had done it so well that the news of Edmund's death had reached him as a line in a letter, and he had read it standing at this same window, and had felt the ice hold, the ice he had made, the ice that was the whole architecture of him. Except that it had not held, not entirely. Something had cracked in him that day and never quite closed, and it was through that hairline crack, he suspected, that the boy had gotten in, the boy Thomas, Edmund's son, sent home to Blackmere by a foreign charity when there was nowhere else on earth for him to go, and taken in by the cold Duke, because a man did not abandon his brother's child even if he could not bear to look at him. And now, through the same crack, a governess had gotten in as well, a woman with a red wheal rising on her shoulder who had looked at the Duke of Blackmere as though he were merely a man, and who had told him, in his own house, a true thing that no one had dared tell him in 15 years. He turned from the window. This would not do. A day of feeling was a day of weakness, and the Duke of Blackmere had not built what he had built by permitting himself weakness. He rang for his steward. Mr. Halloway came, a careful gray man who had served Blackmere for 20 years and knew precisely how to be useful without being seen. Nathaniel put to him 3 questions. First, on whose recommendation had the tutor Kroll been engaged? Second, what was known of Miss Frances Thorne, her people, and her character? Third, When had his cousin Mr. Alaric Vane last been at Blackmere, and when was he expected again? Mr. Halloway's careful face grew, at the mention of the tutor and the cousin in a single breath, a shade more careful. "Mr. Kroll came to us, your grace," he said, "upon the particular recommendation of Mr. Vane. Your cousin was good enough to say that he had known Mr. Kroll to be a man of firm principle and sound scholarship, and as your grace had, forgive me, expressed no wish to interview the man yourself, I engaged him upon that recommendation." "Upon my cousin's recommendation?" "Yes, your grace." Nathaniel said nothing for a moment. He was aware of a slow, cold clarity assembling itself in his mind, the way ice forms on still water from the edges inward. Alaric Vane, his father's sister's son, a smooth, handsome man of 40 with expensive habits and a thin income and an interest in the affairs of Blackmere that had, of late, grown markedly warmer. Nathaniel had never married. Nathaniel had no child. And the boy Thomas Edmund's son, born abroad, of a marriage that Edmund had made in haste and poverty, and that no one at Blackmere had witnessed, stood, if he stood at all, between Alaric Vane and a dukedom. "And Miss Thorne," said the Duke. "A clergyman's daughter, your grace, from the north. The father dead these 3 years, the living gone to another man, the family circumstances much reduced. She came to us with a character from Lady Melcourt, in whose household she served 2 years as governess and companion, and Lady Melcourt's character was unusually warm. I have it here if your grace wishes." Mr. Halloway hesitated. "She has no fortune and no connections of any consequence." "She engaged, your grace, at a wage somewhat below the usual, on the understanding that the post was that the child was said to be difficult." "The child," said Nathaniel, "is not difficult. The child is grieving and was being beaten for it by a man my cousin put into my house. Those are 2 separate facts, Halloway, and I find that I have been slow to observe either. That is my failing, and I will mend it. You will do the following." And he gave his instructions, cold and precise, one after another, and Mr. Halloway wrote them in his little book. That Kroll was to be turned out of Blackmere on the morrow, without a character, and paid only to the day, that the schoolroom was to be kept warm and properly furnished, that a physician was to attend Miss Thorne's shoulder if Mrs. Ashe judged it needful, and that a quiet inquiry was to be set on foot, through the family solicitor, and through no one connected to Mr. Vane, into the circumstances of the late Lord Edmund's marriage and the standing of his son. "And my cousin," said the Duke. "Mr. Vane wrote a sennight ago, your grace, proposing to come to Blackmere for the shooting. I had not yet replied." "Reply," said Nathaniel, "that Blackmere will be glad to receive him." He saw the flicker of surprise in his steward's eyes and answered it. "A man learns nothing of his enemy by keeping him at a distance, Halloway. He learns it by keeping him at his table. Invite my cousin. Make him welcome. And say nothing to him of Kroll beyond that the man proved unsatisfactory and was let go." When the steward had gone, Nathaniel sat down at last at his desk, and drew toward him not the pile of letters but a single sheet of paper, and looked at it for a long while without writing anything upon it. He was thinking of Frances Thorne. He was thinking of the way she had said, "When there is no one to speak for a person, the kindest silence in the world will let him be carried off." She had not known, when she said it, how nearly she had described the whole history of his brother. She had not known that she was speaking of a house in which silence had killed a gentle man by degrees over 30 years, and that she was speaking it to the man whose silence had been the last and coldest of them all. She had meant the boy. But Nathaniel had heard the larger thing, and it had lodged in him, and it would not come out. He did not send for her that day, though he found he wished to. It would not be seemly, and more than that it would not be safe, not for her, whose place in the house depended on there being nothing whatever remarkable in her relation to its master, and not for him, who had felt the ice turn over 3 times in a single afternoon, and did not trust himself near the cause of it. He went instead, when the light failed, to look in upon the boy, and found him asleep in the small bed in the small warm room to which he had been moved by someone's order, Mrs. Ashe's, Nathaniel supposed, for it was not his, with a candle left burning low against the dark, which was against the rules of the house and which the Duke, standing in the doorway, did not order put out. On the table by the bed lay a slate, and on the slate, in a child's laborious hand, someone had helped him to write a single line of letters over and over, THOMAS, his name, as though the boy were practicing the fact of his own existence, as though someone patient had sat with him in the warmth and taught him, letter by letter, that he was a person with a name, that he was Thomas, that he was real. Nathaniel stood over the slate a long time. Then he went to his cold rooms and his cold bed, and he lay awake in the dark, and for the first time in more years than he could easily count he permitted himself to think, without at once thrusting it away, of his brother's face. In the morning Mr. Kroll was turned out of Blackmere. Nathaniel did not receive him. He had the man informed of his dismissal through Halloway and had him watched to the gate, and he stood at his study window and observed the tutor's departure, the stiff, furious walk, the 2 glances back at the great house, the second of them, Nathaniel thought, not the glance of a beaten man, but of a man calculating where to carry his grievance. He filed the observation away. He had not built Blackmere by mistaking the difference between an enemy who was finished and an enemy who was merely gone. Then he did a thing he had not done in the 7 months of the boy's residence, and had not, in truth, planned to do until the moment he found himself doing it. He went up to the schoolroom. It was warm now. His order had been obeyed, a proper fire burned in the grate, and the mean gray chill of the day before had been driven back into the corners. Frances Thorne stood at the window with the boy. The 2 of them bent over something on the sill, and her voice, low and unhurried, was reading out the names of the birds that came to the bare lime trees. "That is a fieldfare, Thomas, do you see, come down from the north for the winter, as we did." And the boy was repeating the word after her, fieldfare, with great care, and neither of them had heard the Duke come to the door. Nathaniel stood and watched them for a moment before they knew he was there, which was, he was aware, the same trick he had played upon Kroll, the master arriving unseen to learn the truth of his house. But this time what the trick showed him was not cruelty. It was the opposite of cruelty. It was a woman with a bruised shoulder teaching a grieving child the names of birds so that the world might grow, 1 word at a time, a little less frightening to him. And Nathaniel, watching, felt the ice give way again in that hidden place, farther and more dangerously than before, and knew that he was in a difficulty for which the whole cold architecture of his life had left him wholly unprepared. Then the boy saw him and went still, and Frances turned, and the Duke composed his face into the mask it had worn for 15 years and stepped into the warm room. "Your Grace," said Frances, and dropped a curtsy that was correct in every particular, and yet contrived, somehow, to remain her own, as though she gave the form of deference without surrendering the substance of herself. The boy imitated her, ducking his head, and Nathaniel saw that overnight the child had learned to look at his uncle without flinching, and understood that this too was the governess's doing, that she had spent some part of the morning teaching Thomas that the Duke was not to be feared. "Miss Thorne, your shoulder." "Mends well, your Grace. Mrs. Ashe is a better physician than most physicians. I am quite able to my work." She said it lightly, but he saw that she held the arm a little stiffly, and he resolved that the physician would attend her whether she thought it needful or not. "I have come," said the Duke, and found that he had not, in fact, prepared what he had come to say, to see that the room was made warm. "It is very warm now, your Grace. Thomas and I are grateful for it." A small pause. "He has been telling me the names of the birds. He has a quick eye for them." Nathaniel looked at the boy. "Have you?" he said. The child, prompted by some pressure of the governess's hand upon his shoulder, or perhaps by nothing but his own gathering courage, said, "There was a fieldfare, sir, in the lime tree. Miss Thorne says they come from far away." "They do," said Nathaniel, "from Norway over the sea. They come when the cold comes and go home again in the spring." He heard himself saying it and marveled distantly that he knew such a thing, that some boyhood of his own survived in him under all the ice, a boy who had watched birds from a schoolroom window in this same house and been beaten for wool gathering. "My brother knew all their names," he said before he had decided to say it. "Your father. He kept a book of them with drawings he made himself. "It will be somewhere in the library still. I will find it for you." The boy's whole face changed. "My father drew birds. He drew them very well, better than the books do." Nathaniel discovered that this was difficult to say and said it anyway, and was rewarded, if that was the word, by the sight of the child turning to the governess with a look of such open wonder "my father drew birds," that the Duke had to turn his own face to the window to master it. When he had mastered it, he said, in a voice he made ordinary, "You will have the book, Thomas, and Miss Thorne you will send to me for anything the schoolroom wants. Anything at all. It has been neglected. That is at an end." He did not stay. He could not. He had reached again the border of what he could bear and remain the Duke. But at the door he paused as she had paused the day before, and he said, without turning, "You did a brave thing, Miss Thorne, braver than you perhaps understand. I have not thanked you for it as I ought. I do so now." And he heard her say behind him softly, "There is no need to thank me, your grace. Anyone would have done it." "No," said the Duke, and now he did turn, and he looked at her across the warm room with the boy between them. "They would not. I have lived 40 years in the world, Miss Thorne, and I can count upon one hand the people I have known who would step in front of a blow for another and think nothing of it. You are mistaken about your fellow creatures. Most of them would have stood aside." He held her gaze a moment longer than was proper, and saw the color come up in her face, and made himself go. "Good morning," he said, and went down the cold stairs with something loosening in his chest that he did not have a name for and was half afraid to find one. So the thaw began, though Nathaniel would not for a long time have called it that, would have named it anything else. A duty discharged, an injustice corrected, the ordinary attention any master owed a house he had let run cold. It showed itself in small things, and he permitted the small things because each one, taken singly, could be defended as reason and not as feeling. He found Edmund's book of birds and sent it to the schoolroom. He directed that the boy should ride, and had a quiet old pony brought up from the home farm. And once, only once, he told himself, came down to the paddock to watch the first lesson, and stood at the rail in the cold while Francis Thorne led the pony and the boy gripped the mane white-knuckled, and then by degrees did not, and at last laughed aloud, a real child's laugh, the first Nathaniel had heard from him, and the Duke found that he was smiling, actually smiling, and wiped it from his face before anyone should see, though he suspected the governess had seen, for she glanced up at the rail just then, and something passed between them across the muddy paddock that neither of them named. He took to walking in the gray afternoons, in the part of the park that could be seen from the schoolroom window, and told himself it was for his health. He took to inquiring of Mrs. Ashe after the boy, and after Miss Thorne's shoulder, and told himself it was a master's proper concern. He took to lingering, when he brought the boy some small thing, a magnifying glass for the study of feathers, a warmer coat, a book, and to speaking with the governess of the child's progress, and then, insensibly, of other things, of the birds of the north country she came from, of books, of the strange dark history of the house whose portrait she asked him about with a frank curiosity that no one else had ever dared to show. And Nathaniel, who had not conversed with anyone in 15 years save to command or to fence, found himself conversing, and found that he had forgotten how much he had once liked it, and that Francis Thorne was quick and dry and unafraid, that she would argue a point with him and hold it, that she laughed at his rare cold jokes as though they were merely jokes and not the pronouncements of a duke, and that being spoken to by her as a man rather than as a title was like coming in from a cold he had lived in so long he had stopped feeling it, and feeling, for the first time in years, the ache of thawing hands. He learned her story in pieces over those weeks, never asking directly, for a duke did not interrogate a governess about her heart, but she gave it to him in fragments without self-pity, the way she gave everything. Her father had been a clergyman in a poor northern parish, a good man, learned and gentle, who had taught his only daughter Latin and Greek and the names of the birds, and the belief dangerous, Nathaniel thought, in a woman of no fortune, that every soul alive was of equal worth in the sight of heaven and ought to be treated so upon the earth. He had died when she was 22. The living had gone to another. The small savings had gone to the debts, and Frances Thorne, gently bred and penniless, had done the only thing such a woman could do, and gone out into other people's houses to raise other people's children, and had been, he gathered, not always kindly used. "One learns," she said once lightly, mending the boy's coat by the schoolroom fire while Nathaniel stood at the window with his hands behind his back, "to be useful and to expect little. It is not so hard a life as some. I have a roof and my bread and the company of children who are better company than most grown persons. And now and then she bit off a thread now and then one is fortunate in one's charge, and then it is not a hard life at all." "You mean the boy?" "Mean the boy." She looked up and the firelight was on her face, and Nathaniel thought with a plainness that startled him that she was beautiful, not in the arranged and armored way of the women of his own world, but in some warmer, more perishable way, a beauty made of kindness worn close to the surface. "He is a dear child, your grace, and he has been very brave, and he asks for so little, only to be told that he is not alone." She returned to her mending. "It is not so much to ask, I think. It is the thing everyone most wishes to be told, and the thing hardest to believe when one has had reason to doubt it." Nathaniel said nothing. He was thinking that she had, without knowing it, named the exact wound of his own life, that he had spent 40 years being alone on purpose so that no one might ever have the power to leave him, and that he had called it strength, and that this penniless clergyman's daughter had seen straight through the whole magnificent cold edifice of the Duke of Blackmere in a matter of weeks, and had pitied him for it quietly, without ever once presuming to say so. It ought to have angered him. It did not. It made him want, absurdly, to tell her things he had told no one about Edmund, about his father, about the boy he had been at the schoolroom window watching the fieldfares come down from the north. And he mastered the want, because a duke did not. But the wanting itself was a country he had not set foot in for so long that its air made him unsteady. It was into this slow secret unfreezing, which Nathaniel guarded as a miser guards a hidden coin, ashamed and unwilling to give it up, that his cousin Alaric Vane arrived at Blackmere for the shooting. Nathaniel received him in the great hall and watched him come, and read him as he had trained himself over a lifetime to read men. Alaric Vane was a handsome man gone very slightly soft, with fair hair carefully arranged to hide where it had begun to thin, and a tailor's bill on his back that Nathaniel doubted had been paid, and a smile of such practiced warmth that it took a hard eye to see that it never once reached the pale, flat eyes above it. He came forward with both hands out. "Cousin," he said. "Nathaniel, it has been an age. You look well, you look exactly as you always do, which is to say entirely unmoved by the passage of time. How do you contrive it? The rest of us grow old, and you simply grow more like a monument." "Alaric," said the Duke, and gave him one hand and not two, "you are welcome to Blackmere." "I am always happy to be at Blackmere." Something in the way he said it, some faint proprietary warmth, as of a man surveying a house he expects one day to own. "And how does the little establishment go on? I heard, forgive me, I heard you had some trouble with the tutor I was so bold as to recommend. Kroll. I was distressed to hear it. I had thought him sound." "He proved unsuitable," said Nathaniel. "I let him go." "A pity. A firm hand is so necessary with a child of a delicate pause, and the pale eyes rested on the Duke's face, testing it. "With a child of uncertain temper, and of uncertain circumstances. One would not wish him to grow up wild, poor little fellow, with no proper claim on anyone. It is a charitable thing you do, Nathaniel, taking the boy in. The whole county says so. A charitable thing, and no obligation upon you whatsoever, given the irregularity." There it was, laid down as lightly as a card upon the table and as deliberately. The boy has no proper claim. The boy is an irregularity. You owe him nothing, and any day you like you may set the whole charitable burden down. Nathaniel felt the old cold clarity assemble itself in him, edge to center, and he was glad of it, for it was the one weather in which he had always known exactly what he was. He looked at his smiling cousin and understood, past any further doubt, that Alaric Vane had put Kroll into the house not to teach the boy but to break him, to make of Edmund's son a sullen, cowering, damaged creature whom no one would think fit to be a duke. so that when the question of the succession came at last to be asked, the answer would already have been arranged. "You are good to concern yourself," said Nathaniel, and his voice gave away nothing at all. "But you need not. The boy's circumstances are my affair, and I attend to them. Come, you will want to see your rooms before dinner. We shoot the low covers in the morning." He led his cousin up the great staircase, past the portraits of the cold Dukes of Blackmere, his father chief among them, painted with the cane he had used on both his sons resting across his knees like a scepter. And Nathaniel thought, climbing the stairs with his enemy smiling at his side, of the boy asleep upstairs with a candle burning against the dark, and of the woman who had stepped in front of a blow for him and asked nothing in return, and of the true thing she had said in the schoolroom on the first day, that when there is no one to speak for a person, the kindest silence in the world will let him be carried off. Someone was trying to carry the boy off. Someone had been trying it quietly and patiently for months, and Nathaniel in his cold indifference had all but let it be done. He would not let it be done now. That resolve, when it settled in him, was the coldest and the clearest thing he had felt in years, and it had, at its very center, hidden where even he could scarcely see it, a small stubborn ember of warmth. The boy would be safe, and the woman would be safe, and Alaric Vane would learn before he left Blackmere precisely what it cost a man to make an enemy of the cold Duke when the cold Duke had, at long last, found something he was not willing to lose. Dinner that night was a long, cold ceremony of two men fencing over silver plate, and Nathaniel gave nothing away, and neither did his cousin, and each understood the other perfectly, and both smiled. But as he lay awake afterward, the Duke found that his thoughts did not stay with Alaric Vane and the coming contest. They went, of their own accord, up the cold stairs and along the dark corridor to a warm small room where a candle burned, and to another room beyond it where a governess with a healing shoulder slept, a woman who had come into his frozen house at a wage below the usual to teach a difficult child, and had instead, without in the least intending it, begun to teach its master how to feel again, which was, Nathaniel thought, staring into the dark, a far more dangerous lesson, and one for which neither of them could possibly be prepared. Alaric Vane did not go away after the shooting. He stayed on one graceful pretext and then another. The sport was so fine, the roads were so bad, his cousin's company was so agreeable, though Nathaniel could not recall his cousin ever before finding it so, and the Duke, who had invited him precisely in order to keep him near and study him, found that the strategy cut both ways, for while he watched Vane, Vane watched him, and what Vane watched, Nathaniel came slowly and with alarm to understand, was the Duke's dealings with the schoolroom. For a man may keep a great many secrets, but he cannot easily keep the direction of his own attention from an observer who has reason to look for it, and Alaric Vane had every reason. He had come to Blackmere to ensure that Edmund's son grew up unloved and unfit. And he found, instead of the neglected cowering creature he had arranged, a boy who rode a pony and laughed and knew the names of the birds, and a Duke who, though the Duke betrayed it in nothing that a careless eye could catch, walked in the afternoons where the schoolroom window could see him, and inquired after a governess's shoulder, and had let a candle go on burning against a child's dark that the rules of the house had always before put out. Vane saw it. Nathaniel watched him see it, and knew that he had in his own thawing given his enemy a weapon, and did not know yet how to take it back. "That governess," said Vane one evening idly, turning his wineglass so the firelight ran round its rim. "Thorn, is it? A striking creature for her station. Where did you find her?" "The steward engaged her," said Nathaniel, "in the usual way." "Did he? She has a very forward manner for a servant. I passed her in the gallery this morning, and she looked at me well," he laughed, "as though she were assessing my character and had not thought better of it. I confess I did not care to be looked at so by a governess. In my house I should not keep a servant who forgot her place." A small pause waited. "But then you were always more indulgent than the world gives you credit for, cousin, under all that ice." The pale eyes came up. "Quite a warm heart, I begin to think, for those you take a fancy to." Nathaniel set down his glass. He understood the move exactly. It was a threat dressed as a jest, a warning that Vane had seen what there was to see and would, if it served him, make of it a scandal, the cold duke and the penniless governess. The county's tongue set wagging, the woman's character ruined, her usefulness as a witness or an ally destroyed, and Nathaniel himself made ridiculous, which for a man like Vane was the surest solvent of another man's power. He understood, too, that the danger fell not upon himself. A duke could weather any amount of talk, but upon Frances Thorne, who could weather none, whose whole precarious living rested on there being nothing whatever to say about her. One breath of scandal and she would be turned out of every respectable house in England, and Vane knew it, and had chosen his ground with care. "Miss Thorne," said the Duke in the flattest and coldest of his voices, "is an excellent governess, and my ward is fond of her, and I do not concern myself with the manner in which my servants look at my guests. If you find yourself assessed and wanting, cousin, I would suggest the fault lies less with her powers of observation than with the object of them." He rose. "Good night." It was a hit, and he saw it land, and he saw the smile go briefly out of Vane's eyes. But as he climbed the cold stairs he knew he had won nothing, had only shown his enemy where he was vulnerable, and that a man who defends a thing has told the world he values it. He had defended Frances Thorne. He would do it again, he knew, without hesitation, and that very readiness was the danger. He stood a long time that night at his window, looking out at the Black Park, and admitted to himself, because he had never in his life been a man to lie to himself even when the truth was unwelcome, that what he felt for the governess had passed some while ago beyond the bounds of a master's regard, and that he did not know what to do with it, and that it frightened him more than Alaric Vane and all his schemes. He might have withdrawn. A wiser man, a colder man, the man he had been a year before, would have withdrawn at once, would have put the schoolroom at a distance again, resumed the ice, given Vane nothing further to see, and let the feeling starve for want of air. Nathaniel intended to. He resolved upon it that very night, and he broke the resolution within the week because the family solicitor came down from London, and what he brought changed the ground beneath them all. The solicitor's name was Mr. Pruitt, a dry, exact, incorruptible old man who had served Blackmere since Nathaniel's father's day and had no love of the Vanes, and he had come, at the Duke's quiet instruction, to report upon the inquiry into the late Lord Edmund's marriage. He and Nathaniel sat alone in the study with the door shut. "The matter," said Mr. Pruitt, "stands thus, your grace. Your late brother married the lady abroad, a Miss Mary Ashford, an Englishwoman, daughter of a merchant fallen on hard times, resident in the same city. That much is not in dispute. The child Thomas was born of that marriage. That, too, upon the evidence of the register of the English chapel in that city, is not in dispute." He paused. "The difficulty, your grace, is one of proof. The marriage lines, the certificate itself, the document your brother would have carried, have not been found among the effects that came home with the boy. There was little enough. The poor gentleman died in want, and what remained was scattered. The chapel's register would settle the question beyond any doubt. But I regret to inform your grace that I have had a letter, not a week since, from the chaplain who then officiated, now retired to Kent, to say that the register for those very years was, his word, mislaid some months ago, when a gentleman from England, representing himself as acting for the family, applied to consult it." Nathaniel was very still. A gentleman from England. The chaplain did not have the name, your grace, or would not give it. An agent, one supposes. But I will be plain, as you have always required me to be plain. Someone has taken pains that the proof of your brother's marriage should not be found. And without that proof, should the succession ever fall to be contested, the boy's legitimacy, and therefore his claim, and therefore his very standing as your heir, could be put in the gravest doubt. As matters stand, your grace, if you were to die tomorrow, I could not warrant that the child would be recognized. The estate, and the title, would in all likelihood pass to the next male of the line. To my cousin Vane. To Mr. Vane. The two men looked at one another, and there was no need to say the rest of it aloud. Nathaniel felt the cold clarity close over him like deep water, and within it, quite steady now, a single fixed intention. Alaric Vane had not merely put a cruel man into the house to break a child. Alaric Vane had reached across a continent to steal the one paper that stood between a fatherless boy and dispossession, and had then come to Blackmere to see the work finished, to watch the boy grow up unfit, or failing that, unproven, so that the dukedom might fall, clean and unquestioned, into his own soft hands. It was not a hot crime. It was a patient, cold, methodical theft of a child's entire future, and Nathaniel, who knew cold, recognized in his cousin a colder man than himself, and was afraid not for himself. He had long ago stopped being able to fear for himself, but for the boy, and he found, for the woman who had made herself the boy's shield. "Find the register, Mr. Pruitt," he said, "or find the certificate. Send your own man abroad at my charge and let him answer to no one but you and me. Say nothing to my cousin, nothing to the household, nothing to anyone. And Mr. Pruitt, the old solicitor waited draw me a new will, tonight, leaving to the boy Thomas everything that is mine to leave him by my own hand, outside the entail, the unentailed lands, the funds, the London house, all of it, so that whatever befalls the title, the child is not left a beggar. If I cannot secure him the dukedom, I will at the least secure him bread. Bring it to me to sign before you sleep." When the solicitor had gone to his writing, Nathaniel did not remain in the study. He went, though it was late and against every rule of prudence he had set himself, up the cold stairs to the schoolroom corridor, and finding it dark and the boy long asleep, he stood a moment at the child's door, watching the small, even rise and fall of the blanket in the candlelight, and felt the whole weight of what had been done and what might yet be done settle onto him. And when he turned to go he found that Frances Thorne had come out of her own room in her wrapper with a shawl about her shoulders. A candle in her hand, having heard, she said softly, a step in the corridor, and feared it was the boy walking in his sleep, as he sometimes did. They stood facing one another in the narrow, dark passage, the two candles between them, and for a moment neither spoke. She ought to have gone back into her room. He ought to have bid her good night and descended. Neither did. And Nathaniel, looking at her by the small trembling light, her dark hair loose about her shoulders, her face grave and unafraid and full of a concern that was, he understood, for the boy first and for himself second, but that included him, that reached him, that took the Duke of Blackmere into its warmth without the least fear of his cold. Nathaniel felt the last of the ice he had held for 15 years give way beneath him all at once, silently. The whole frozen surface of him going under in the dark, and he did not fight it. "Miss Thorne," he said, very low, "I must tell you a thing and ask a thing, and I can do neither in daylight where we may be seen. Forgive me the impropriety of the hour. There is no impropriety in my intention. I give you my word on that, and you may believe it or not as you choose." "I believe it, your grace," she said simply. "Tell me." So he told her, standing in the cold corridor by the guttering candles, in a low voice, keeping the words few, he told her what the solicitor had found, that someone had stolen the proof of Edmund's marriage, that the boy's whole future hung by a thread, that his cousin Vane was, he was now certain, the hand behind it all, behind Kroll, behind the stolen register, behind the long, patient effort to render a child unfit and unproven. He watched her face as he told it, and he saw no astonishment there, only a deepening of something already grave, and when he had finished she said quietly, "I have felt it. Not the particulars, I could not have guessed the particulars, but the shape of it. Mr. Vane looks at Thomas as a man looks at a debt he means to be rid of, and he looks at me as at an obstacle he has not yet decided how to remove." She lifted her chin. "What is the thing you would ask of me, your grace?" "To help me guard the boy." He had not, until he said it, known precisely what he meant to ask, but it came out whole and true. "You are with him all the hours of the day that I cannot be. You see what I cannot see. I am asking you to be my eyes, Miss Thorne, to tell me at once of anything, however small, that touches the child's safety, and to trust no one in this house upon the matter but me. It is a great deal to ask. It puts you between the boy and a dangerous man, and I have no right to ask you to stand there. You have already taken one blow that was not yours to take. I would not have you take another." She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "You have no need to ask, your grace. I stood between Thomas and harm before you knew my name, and I will do it again and again, for as long as I am able, whether you ask it or no. That is not a thing I do for wages or to oblige a duke. It is a thing I do because he is a child and he is frightened and he is mine to keep, in the only way a person like me is ever given anything to keep. You need not have asked. But, and here her voice changed, softened, and she looked at him in a way that went straight through the ruin of his composure. But I am glad that you did. I am glad that you see him now. He needed his uncle to see him. And I think, if you will forgive me for saying so at such an hour, that his uncle needed it rather more than he knew. Nathaniel could not answer her. He stood in the dark with his heart, which he had bricked up at 12 years old and had believed dead for the better part of his life, beating hard and painful in his chest like a thing waking from a long cold sleep, and he looked at Francis Thorn by the candlelight and did not trust himself to speak. At last he said, roughly, because it was all he could manage, "Good night, Miss Thorn. Bolt your door, and send to me at once if aught troubles you at any hour." "At any hour, do you understand me?" "I understand you, your grace," she said, and there was in her voice a warmth that undid him further. "Good night." He went down the cold stairs with his candle, and signed the new will that Mr. Pruitt brought him near midnight and lay awake till dawn, and knew two things with a certainty that no cold could any longer touch: that he loved her plainly and past all remedy, and that in loving her he had given his enemy and the cold, patient world the one thing capable of wounding him, and that he would not, for the whole of Blackmere and the dukedom besides, wish it undone. For a fortnight it was almost happiness. That was the false dawn of it, though Nathaniel, who did not know he was living in a story, took it for the true morning of a life. The abominable Vane kept to his sport by day and his fencing by night and made no further move, and the household went on in its ordinary way, and the boy grew brighter by the week, rode better, spoke more, laughed oftener, and the duke, throwing prudence to the winds a little more each day, found reasons to be near the schoolroom, near the paddock, near Francis Thorn. They were never alone save by accident and never spoke of what lay unspoken between them. The difference in their stations was a wall neither could climb, and both knew it, and neither said it. But it was there in every glance, in the careful courtesy he showed her that was too careful, in the way she read aloud to the boy of an evening while the duke sat by with a book he did not read, the three of them by the fire, like something Nathaniel had never had and had told himself he did not want, a warmth at the center of the cold house, small and defended, and he let himself believe safe. It was not safe. He knew in the part of him that had survived his father and never learned to hope that it was not safe, that Alaric Vane was not idle but only patient, that a false dawn is only the light by which a colder darkness measures its approach. But he let himself have the fortnight. He had had so little warmth in his life. He let himself have that. And then, on a gray morning at the end of it, Mr. Vane came down to breakfast smiling more warmly than ever, and said that he had, in his idleness, been struck by a curious circumstance regarding the governess, and thought it only right, as a matter of the family's honor, to lay it before his cousin the duke. And Nathaniel, watching the pale, flat eyes above the warm smile, felt the false dawn end. "It grieves me to raise it," said Alaric Vane, buttering his toast with great deliberation, "for I know you set a value on the woman, cousin, and I would not for the world distress you. But a family such as ours cannot be too careful of who is admitted to the intimacy of its house, still less to the keeping of its children. And there are things about your Miss Thorn that I think you cannot know, or you would never have engaged her." Nathaniel did not touch his coffee. "Say what you have to say." "You will recall I found her manner forward. It set me wondering. I made a few inquiries, nothing untoward, merely the ordinary caution any relation of yours might exercise on your behalf, and I have had a most illuminating letter." He drew it from his breast, unhurried, savoring it. "From a lady in the north, a Mrs. Farrot, in whose house Miss Thorn was employed before she went to Lady Melcourt. It seems the reason for her leaving that place was not, as your steward was given to understand, the ordinary ending of an engagement. It seems, cousin, that certain of Mrs. Farrot's jewels went missing during Miss Thorn's residence, and were found, this is the delicate part, among the governess's own possessions. The matter was hushed for the sake of the woman's poor dead father, who had been a clergyman, and she was permitted to leave quietly rather than be given up to the law. But there it is. Your children's governess, Nathaniel, is a thief who has once already escaped a prosecution for it. I have the letter here. You will wish to read it. Nathaniel took the letter. He read it. It was on good paper in a lady's hand, and it said precisely what Vane had said it said, in terms of grieved reluctance and Christian charity, and it was signed Honoria Farrot, and it named the jewels, and it gave dates, and it was, Nathaniel knew before he had finished the first paragraph, a lie from its salutation to its signature, because he knew the woman it accused, knew her as he knew few things in the world, knew that Frances Thorne would sooner starve in a ditch than take what was not hers, had watched her step in front of a cane for a child not her own and ask nothing, and no forged letter on the finest paper in England could make him believe otherwise. He knew it was a lie. He knew, further, exactly whose lie it was, and why it had been told now at the end of the fortnight, with the pale eyes watching for his answer. And he knew this was the trap, and he felt its jaws that his knowledge did not signify. For the letter existed. Whether true or false, it existed, and Alaric Vane held it, and a copy of it, Nathaniel did not doubt, would find its way into the county in a week if it served Vane's purpose, and there was nothing on earth so certain to travel as the ruin of a penniless woman's good name. If Nathaniel kept her, he proclaimed to the world that the cold Duke harbored an accused thief in the nursery, for reasons the world would not be slow to supply, and the reason the world supplied would ruin her more surely than the theft, would follow her the length of her life, would make it impossible for her ever again to be received in any respectable house. If he dismissed her, he threw her out into that same ruin, but quietly, without a public scandal, with a character that might, with care, be patched. Either way she was destroyed. Vane had built the trap with exquisite craft, and its beauty, from Vane's side, was that it did not matter in the least whether the Duke believed the lie. The lie had already done its work by being spoken. "You will dismiss her, of course," said Vane, watching him. "At once. It is the only course. I will myself see that the matter goes no further, for the honor of the family, provided naturally that the woman is gone from Blackmere by nightfall and the boy is put into more suitable hands. I know of a very sound establishment, a school, quite far from here, where a child of his circumstances might be raised without troubling you further. I would be glad to arrange it. You have carried this charitable burden long enough, cousin. Let me lift it from you." And there it was, whole, the entire design laid bare at last across the breakfast silver. Dismiss the woman, remove the shield. Send the boy to a distant school, remove the boy. And Alaric Vane would arrange it all so kindly, so helpfully, and Blackmere would be quiet and cold again, and the child would vanish into some far establishment to be forgotten, and the stolen register would never be found, and one day the title would fall, clean and unquestioned, into the soft, warm hands across the table. It was masterly. Nathaniel could almost have admired it, as one cold man may admire the work of a colder, had it not been aimed at the two people left alive whom he could not lose. He was aware that everything now turned on his face. Vane was watching for the flinch, the heat, the lover's outrage that would confirm what the pale eyes suspected and hand him the second weapon, the scandal, the cold Duke besotted with his thieving governess, ruin doubled. And Nathaniel, who had spent 15 years making his face into a thing that betrayed nothing, made it now betray nothing. He set the letter down. He was cold. He was colder than he had been in a year, colder on purpose, drawing the old ice up over himself deliberately, because it was the only armor that would serve, and because behind it he could think. "You have gone to a great deal of trouble on my behalf, cousin," he said, and his voice was winter itself. "I am obliged to you. Leave the letter with me. I will deal with the matter as I see fit and in my own time, and I will thank you not to speak of it further to me or to anyone, for if one word of this reaches the county Alaric, I shall know precisely from whose mouth it came, and I shall be very much less obliged to you than I am at present. Do we understand one another?" Vane's smile did not falter, but something behind it recalculated. "Perfectly, cousin." "Then let us finish our breakfast." They finished their breakfast. Nathaniel did not taste it. Beneath the ice his mind moved fast and cold and clear, and he saw that he had bought a little time and nothing more, that Vane held the letter and would use it, that the only way to draw its poison was to make Frances Thorne safe from it, and that he could not make her safe while she remained at Blackmere as his ward's governess, in the daily view of a man who had staked everything on destroying her. The letter's power lay in her nearness to him. Remove the nearness and the letter lost its edge, a dismissed governess, gone quietly north with a clean character from the Duke's own hand and a purse to see her settled, was a far smaller target than a governess kept on at Blackmere against a charge of theft while the Duke mooned after her. He could protect her, but only by sending her away. It was the coldest logic and it was sound, and Nathaniel hated it with a completeness that frightened him, and he could see no flaw in it, and that was the true dark hour of him. Not that his pride reasserted itself, though the world watching would have said his pride had, but that his love itself, clear-eyed and desperate, could find no way to keep her near that did not destroy her. To love her was to send her away. The one act contained the other. He understood, sitting cold at his own table, that this was the exact mechanism by which his father's house had always worked. That here, again, was the old lesson, that to feel is to be given a door through which pain enters, and that he had opened the door after all, fool that he was, and the pain had come. He sent for her that afternoon to the study, formally, with the door open and a footman within call, everything correct, everything cold, everything arranged to be exactly what it was and nothing that could be whispered. Frances came in her gray gown with her hands folded and her chin level, and she looked at his face, and Nathaniel saw her read the ice there, and saw her not understand it, and it was the hardest thing he had ever done to keep the ice in place while she looked at him so. "Miss Thorne," he said, "circumstances have arisen that make it necessary to end your engagement at Blackmere. You will be paid to the quarter and beyond it. You will have a character from my own hand in the warmest terms that will secure you any place you wish, and a sum will be settled on you sufficient to keep you in comfort while you seek one. A carriage will take you north on Thursday. That is 3 days hence. I am sorry for the shortness of the notice. It cannot be helped." He watched the words strike her. He watched her face, which had never once been afraid of him, go still with something that was not fear but was worse, a bewildered wounding, the look of a person who has trusted and cannot understand why the trust has been struck from her hand. She was silent a moment. Then she said, very quietly, "May I know the circumstances, your grace?" "You may not." "Have I failed in my duty to the child?" "You have not. Your care of the boy has been beyond any fault." He said it because it was true and because he could not, even now, let her believe otherwise, and he saw that his saying it only deepened her bewilderment, for it made the dismissal senseless, and she was not a woman who could rest in the senseless. "Then why?" she said, and when he did not answer, "Your grace, 3 days ago you asked me to be your eyes, to guard the boy, to trust no one in this house but you. You told me the boy's whole future hung by a thread and that a dangerous man was pulling at it. Nothing in that has changed. The danger is greater today than it was. I can feel it in the very air of the house. And now you send me away, me, who would stand in front of a cannon for that child with 3 days' notice and no reason. I have obeyed you in everything. I have earned, I think, the right to be told why you are doing a thing that will leave Thomas alone in this house with the very danger you set me to watch. So I will ask you once more plainly, and I will not ask again. Why are you sending me away?" And Nathaniel, holding the ice with both hands, could not tell her. He could not say that a man had forged a lie that named her a thief, and that he could only draw its poison by putting distance between them, for the words themselves would frighten her more than any comfort they carried, would tell her she was accused, would put upon her the weight of a ruin he was spending everything he had to keep off her. He could not say that he loved her, and that his love was the very thing that endangered her, and that the only shelter he could give her was his absence. He could not say any of it without unmaking the cold thing he was doing, which was the only thing that could save her. So he said the cruelest thing instead, the thing that would close the matter, the thing his father would have said, and he hated himself as he said it. "Because I wish it, Miss Thorne. A master does not account to a governess for his household arrangements. You have been useful and you are no longer required. That is the whole of it, and it is enough." He looked away from her out the tall window at the gray park because he could not do it to her face. "The carriage comes Thursday. You may take your leave of the boy. Please do not distress him with more than the occasion requires. That will be all." There was a silence behind him. It went on a long time, and then he heard her say in a voice from which all the warmth had been taken, not by anger, he understood. Anger he could have borne, taken instead by a grief that was worse than anger because it did not accuse him, it only mourned, "I see. Forgive me, your grace, I mistook the footing I stood on. I thought it does not matter what I thought." A pause. "I have never in my life taken what was not mine from any house I served. I do not know what has been said of me, for something has, I am not a fool. But whatever it is false, and I had hoped that you, of all the men in the world, knew me well enough to know it was false. I find that I was wrong. That is the hardest of it, not the going, but the discovering that I was wrong about that. Good day, your grace. I will not distress the boy. I would never distress the boy. He is the one thing in this house that was ever true to me." And she went. Nathaniel heard the door and did not turn, and stood at the window with the gray park swimming before him, and understood that she had told him in the same breath, both that she knew herself accused, and that she believed he had believed the accusation, that she had walked out of the room thinking the Duke of Blackmere had looked at a forged letter and taken it for truth and cast her off as a thief, which was the one thing he had most wished to spare her, and had, by his cold silence, done more surely than any words could have done. He had protected her from the world's ruin at the cost of her belief in him. He had done it to keep her safe, and it did not feel like safety. It felt like the coldest room in his father's cold house, and he was 12 years old again and standing dry-eyed by a coffin, having learned once more the only lesson Blackmere had ever truly taught, that love is a door, and that the Dukes of Blackmere spend their lives learning to keep it shut, and pay for the learning with everything warm they ever had. That night he did not sleep at all. And in the black hour before dawn, when a man's defenses are thinnest and his truths come up unbidden, Nathaniel of Blackmere sat alone by a dead fire, and admitted that he had done the wrong thing, that there had been another road, harder and more dangerous, in which he stood beside her openly, and dared the world to make it scandal, and fought the lie with the truth, and kept her near, and kept the boy safe, and did not, God help him, send away the one warm soul who had ever walked willingly into his cold. And that he had not taken it because he was afraid, because the old lesson had risen up in him at the moment of trial, and he had reached for the ice as a drowning man reaches for what has always held him, and it had held him, and it had cost him her. He had until Thursday, 2 days. He sat by the dead fire, and he did not yet know what he would do, only that the ice, which had saved him all his life, had this once betrayed him utterly, and that he would rather go under warm than be saved cold ever again. He did not know, sitting there, that he had less time than he thought. He did not know that Alaric Vane, watching the household with his pale, patient eyes, had seen the governess come white-faced from the study, and had understood that the Duke meant to send her off quietly rather than break with her, had understood, that is, that his letter had not fully worked, that the woman was to be protected in her going rather than ruined in her staying, and had decided that very night that the time for patience was over. He did not know that while he sat by his dead fire, his cousin was writing letters of a different kind, and making arrangements that would not wait for Thursday. He learned it in the morning, when Mrs. Ashe came to his door, gray-faced with the news that the boy's bed was empty, that Thomas was nowhere in the house, and that Mr. Vane's carriage and Mr. Vane were both gone from Blackmere before the servants had risen. Nathaniel was down the stairs and in the empty schoolroom before he had well understood that he was moving. The small bed was cold. The book of birds lay open on the sill where the boy had left it. There was no note, no sign of struggle. A child of 6, taken quietly in the dark by a man he had been taught to obey, would make no struggle, and the Duke stood in the gray morning room where he had first seen a woman step in front of a cane, and felt a fear so total and so unfamiliar that for a moment it emptied him of every thought. Then it burned the ice away. All of it at once, the whole frozen architecture of 40 years, gone in the heat of a single clean terror, and what was left standing in the schoolroom was not the cold Duke of Blackmere but a man whose child had been stolen. And that man turned and went to find the one other person on earth who loved the boy as he did. Frances was already dressed, already down, standing in the corridor with her face white and her hands clasped hard before her, and when she saw the Duke's face she did not wait for him to speak. "Mrs. Ashe has told me," she said. "Vane has taken him, in the night." No reproach in it, no reference to the study, to the dismissal, to the cruelty he had done her, all of that set aside as though it had never been, because the boy was gone and nothing else could matter until he was found. "Your Grace, listen to me and do not waste breath on being surprised that I know things. 3 days ago I began to watch, as you asked. Yesterday, before you sent for me, I saw Mr. Vane's man, the sour one who came with him, in the stable yard, arranging for the traveling chaise to be ready and provisioned before light, and speaking with a person I did not know, a hired man, and I heard the word Harwich. The coast. Harwich, your Grace. If they mean to take Thomas out of the country, to some school abroad, or worse, to somewhere he can simply be lost, then it is Harwich, and it is the eastern road, and they have perhaps 4 hours' start, no more, for the boy will slow them, and a chaise is not a fast thing on the winter roads." Nathaniel looked at her. In the midst of everything he found room to understand, wholly and finally, what he had nearly thrown away. This woman who, dismissed and wounded and believing herself thought a thief by the man she had trusted, had still spent her last hours in his house watching over his child, had gathered the very intelligence that might save the boy, and now stood offering it to him without a single word of what he had done to her. He had a great deal to say to her. There was no time to say any of it. He said the only part that could not wait. "I was wrong," he said. "In everything I said to you in that room I was wrong, and the reasons I did it do not excuse it, and I will tell you all of them and beg your pardon on my knees when the boy is safe. Not now. Now will you come with me? I have no right to ask it, but he will be frightened, and yours is the face he will most wish to see, and his voice went, and he let it go, past caring now for how much it showed. I would rather have you beside me in this than any man in England." "I was never going to do anything else," said Frances Thorne. "Order the horses." They did not take a carriage. A carriage would have been slower than the chaise they chased. Nathaniel had the 2 best horses in his stable saddled, a hunter for himself and a steady bay mare for Frances, who could ride. He learned, as she could do most things, plainly and well and without fuss. And he sent a groom galloping for the magistrate and another with a written summons for Mr. Prewitt the solicitor to follow with the constables to Harwich. And then he and Frances rode out of Blackmere into the grey east wind, and the Duke did not once look back at the cold house. They rode hard. The eastern road was mired with winter and empty in the early hours, and at each posting inn and turnpike Nathaniel flung down a coin and a question, a traveling chaise, a fair-haired gentleman, a small dark-haired boy, and at each the answer came back, "Yes, ahead of you, an hour, less than an hour, they change horses and press on. The little gentleman was crying, sir. We thought it strange." Frances rode at his side and said little and missed nothing, and when at the third in the ostler said the boy had been crying and would not be comforted, Nathaniel saw her hands tighten on the reins and her jaw set, and he thought that he had never in his life seen courage wear a plainer or a dearer face. "He is not far now," she said. "They lose time at every change because the boy fights them. A frightened child is the slowest cargo in the world, your Grace. He is buying us the minutes without knowing it. Brave boy, brave, brave boy." They caught the chaise a little after noon, on a bleak stretch of the eastern road, where the country ran flat and grey to a flat grey sea still miles off, the road lifting over a low bridge where a swollen stream had half washed the way and forced all traffic to a crawl. The chaise was stopped at the near end of the bridge, its horses blowing, its wheel dropped into a rut, and Vane's sour man was down cursing at it. And inside Nathaniel saw the small white face at the glass, and everything in him that was not the boy fell away. Inside was Thomas, and beside the boy, one hand clamped upon his arm, sat Alaric Vane. Nathaniel put the hunter across the last quarter-mile at a pace that would have broken a lesser horse and was off it before it had fully stopped, and he wrenched open the door of the chaise, and he did not in that moment remember that he was a duke or a cold man or anything at all but the boy's uncle. "Thomas," he said, "Thomas, I have you. You are safe." And the boy, at the sight of him, at the sight Nathaniel saw of Francis swinging down from the bay mare behind him, the two of them come together out of the gray like everything the child had been told he could not have. The boy came off the seat and into his uncle's arms with a cry that went through the duke like a blade. And Nathaniel gathered him up, this small shaking body that was his brother's son, and he understood now past all his old cold denials, his own to love and keep. And he held him hard against the winter wind and felt the boy's arms lock about his neck, and over the small dark head he looked at Alaric Vane. "Cousin," said Vane. He had not moved from his seat. He was pale, and his careful hair was disarranged, and the smile was quite gone now, and what was under it was uglier and more honest than anything Nathaniel had seen on his face before. "You have had a cold ride for nothing. I was doing you a kindness, removing the encumbrance. The boy is no true Blackmere. You know it as well as I. There is no proof he is anything but a merchant's bastard your soft-hearted brother took up abroad, and I merely spared you the trouble of—" "Be silent." Nathaniel's voice was very low, and the wind took it, but Vane heard it and stopped. The duke set the boy down gently and put him into Francis's arms. She took him, wrapped him in her cloak, murmured into his hair the words Nathaniel had heard her use before, the same steady litany over and over, and then Nathaniel turned back to his cousin, and he was, for the first time in the whole affair, entirely and terribly himself. Not the ice and not the fear, but the cold clarity married at last to a heat he no longer troubled to hide. "You stole a child from his bed in the dark," said the duke. "You put a cruel man over him to break him. You reached across the sea to steal the proof of my brother's marriage so that you might rob his son of his name and his bread and his home. And you have this morning attempted to carry a peer's ward and heir out of England against his will and against mine. Each of those is a crime, Alaric. Together they are the ruin of you, and the ruin is coming. For I have sent for the magistrate and for my solicitor and for the constables, and they are on this road behind me, and you will not reach the coast, and you will not leave this county a free man." He paused. "You mistook me, cousin. You thought me cold, and you thought that a cold man could be relied upon not to care enough to fight you. You were right about the cold and wrong about the rest, and the error will cost you everything you have." Vane's eyes went past him, calculating still, to the empty road behind, to the flat country, to the bridge and the swollen stream, weighing flight. And finding no flight worth the trying, they came back, and the last of the smiling mask fell off, and what spoke then was pure and frightened malice. "Proof," he said. "You speak very grand, cousin, but you have no proof of any of it. A stolen register that no one can find. A tutor who did no more than his office. A letter about the governess that I had in perfect good faith. And as for this morning, why, I took my little cousin for an airing, and grew concerned for his health among strangers, and there is not a magistrate in England will hang a man's word against a duke's fancy on the strength of a governess's tale. You have nothing, Nathaniel. You have a warm heart and cold hands and nothing at all to close them on." "He has this," said a voice. Nathaniel turned. A rider had come up the road from the coast side while they spoke, not from Blackmere, from ahead, from the direction of Harwich and the sea, a mud-spattered plain man on a blown horse, and he swung down and came forward, and Nathaniel knew him. Mr. Prewitt's clerk, the young man the solicitor had sent abroad at the Duke's charge to find what Vane's agent had stolen. He had landed at Harwich that very morning, he said, off the packet, riding for Blackmere with his news, and had by the plainest chance in the world met the Duke's own groom on the road not an hour since and been turned about to find his master here. He was breathless and filthy and shining with the particular joy of a young man who has done a hard thing and done it well, and he drew from an oilskin at his breast a folded paper, and he put it into the Duke's hand. "The marriage lines, your grace," he said, "certified true and entire from the register of the English chapel, under the hand and seal of the present chaplain and witnessed before the consul. The old register was not destroyed, sir, only carried off, and I traced the man who carried it, an English agent, to a lodging in the port, and I will not trouble your grace with how I came by what he had, but I have the certified copy here, sworn and sealed, and I have besides the agent's own written statement, given for consideration and before witnesses, naming the person in England who paid him to steal it." The young man's eyes went, quite steadily, to Alaric Vane. "The person named, your grace, is the gentleman in the chaise." There was a silence on the grey road. The wind moved in the flat grass. Nathaniel unfolded the paper and read it, and it was what the young man had said, the record of a marriage, entire and lawful and witnessed, between Lord Edmund Blackmere and Mary Ashford, and the birth thereafter of a son, Thomas, lawful issue of that marriage, heir of his father's body and after the Duke of Blackmere itself. And Nathaniel read it standing on the road with his brother's vindication and his ward's whole future in his cold hand. And he felt something break in him that was not ice and was not grief, but was very near to both, and he did not fight it, and did not care that Francis saw. "You were saying, cousin," said the Duke, "that I had nothing to close my hands on." Alaric Vane made a sound. It was not a word. He came half out of the chaise, and his face had gone from pale to a mottled gray, and for a moment Nathaniel thought he would run, or fight, or fall. And what he did instead was worse, and truer, and told the whole of him. He looked at the boy in the governess's arms, the small vindicated heir who stood now forever between Alaric Vane and everything he had schemed and stolen and traveled to secure, and his frightened malice found its last and lowest expression, and his hand went to the traveling pistol in the chaise pocket. He never reached it. Francis Thorne had set the boy down and stepped. Nathaniel saw it, and his heart stopped, stepped not away from the danger but toward it, putting herself again, as she had the first time he ever saw her, between harm and a child. But this time she did not need to take the blow. This time the Duke of Blackmere was there. Nathaniel had crossed the space between himself and his cousin before he knew he had moved, and he took Vane's wrist in a grip that had once, before he was a cold man, unhorsed larger men than this, and he bore the pistol down and twisted it from the soft hand and flung it into the swollen stream, and he held his cousin against the chaise by the front of his fine stolen coat, and looked into the pale, flat, frightened eyes from a distance of inches. "You would have harmed him," said Nathaniel very quietly, "even now, even with everything lost. That is what you are, Alaric, that is the whole of what you are." He did not strike him. He wanted to, his whole body wanted to, and he did not, because the boy was watching, and because a man teaches a child what a man is by what he does in such a moment, and Nathaniel of Blackmere had decided, somewhere on the cold road that morning, precisely what kind of man his brother's son would learn from. He let his cousin go. "The constables are behind me on this road," he said, stepping back. "You may wait for them here, or you may run and be taken running. It is the same to me. But you will never again come within a mile of this child, or of that lady, or of anything of mine, so long as you live, and after what these papers will do to you, cousin, I do not think you will find many doors in England open to try." And down the eastern road, as if summoned by the words, came the sound of many hoofs, and Nathaniel looked up and saw the magistrate's party breasting the low rise. The magistrate and Mr. Pruitt in a jolting gig, and 4 mounted constables riding hard through the grey noon toward the bridge, toward the stopped chaise, toward the end of Alaric Vane. And the Duke of Blackmere turned his back on his cousin as on a thing already finished, and went to where Francis stood with the boy, and stood with them, the 3 of them together on the cold road with the certified proof of the child's whole future warm in his hand, and did not let go of either of them again. Alaric Vane did not run. Perhaps he had not the nerve for it. Perhaps he understood, as the constables closed about the stopped chaise on the grey bridge, that a man who runs is a man already judged, and that his one remaining hope lay in the county's long reluctance to believe ill of a Blackmere by blood. It was a thin hope, and it did not survive the day. The magistrate, a stout and honest squire named Sir Robert Fenn, who had known the late Lord Edmund as a boy, and had never in his life had cause to love the Vanes, took the sworn statement of Mr. Pruitt's clerk, and the agent's signed confession, and the certified marriage lines, and the plain evidence of a peer's heir carried half across England toward the sea against his uncle's will. And by the time the winter light was failing, He had heard enough to commit Alaric Vane to answer at the assizes for the theft of the register, the abduction of the child, and a matter Sir Robert seemed to regard as gravest of all, the forging of a letter to blast the character of an innocent woman. For that letter had come apart in the magistrate's hands within the hour. Mr. Pruitt, dry and exact and merciless, had needed only to be shown it. There was no Mrs. Honoria Farrot of the northern county named. The solicitor, who forgot nothing and kept lists of everything, knew the whole of Frances Thorne's history from her engagement, having examined it himself, and knew that she had gone to Lady Melcourt not from any Mrs. Farrot's house but directly from the parsonage where her father had died, that there was no prior place, no missing jewels, no hushed prosecution, no truth of any kind in the thing from top to bottom. It was a fabrication entire. And when the paper was set beside a note in Alaric Vane's own hand that Nathaniel produced from among his cousin's abandoned effects in the chaise, even Sir Robert's dull country eye could see that the lady's flowing script and the gentleman's were formed by one and the same pen. That Alaric Vane had sat down and invented a woman and a crime, and a whole false past to destroy a governess who had made herself an obstacle, and had very nearly succeeded. And would have succeeded had the Duke of Blackmere not known, past all lies, exactly who Frances Thorne was. Nathaniel watched the letter exposed, and watched his cousin's face as the last shred of his standing was stripped from him before the magistrate and the constables and his own sour dismissed servant, who, seeing which way the wind had turned, discovered a sudden fluency and gave up everything he knew for the sake of his own neck. And the Duke found, watching, that he felt no triumph in it. He had expected triumph. He had ridden the eastern road that morning with a cold hunger for exactly this, the ruin of the man who had reached for the two people he loved. But standing in the failing light with the boy safe and the truth plain, what he felt instead was something quieter and sadder, the recognition that Alaric Vane was, at bottom, only another cold thing that a cold house had made. A man who had wanted and schemed, and never once in his life loved anything but his own advantage, and who was going now into disgrace with nothing warm to take with him, nothing to mourn or be mourned by. And Nathaniel understood with a clarity that shook him, that he had been within a few degrees of becoming exactly such a man himself, and would have, had a penniless governess not walked into his frozen house and taught him, without ever meaning to, that there was another way for a man to live. He said none of this. He said only to Sir Robert that he would see the prosecution pressed to its full extent, and would spare no expense in it, and that his solicitor was at the magistrate's disposal. And then he turned from the whole cold business of the law and gave the rest of his attention, which was the whole of his heart, to the boy and the woman he had come to save. They did not ride home that night. The boy was spent past riding, and Frances near it, and Nathaniel took rooms at the best in the mean coast road afforded and saw them fed and warmed, and sat up half the night in a chair by the boy's bed while Thomas slept at last, deeply and without the walking terrors, one small hand fisted in the Duke's sleeve as though even in sleep he did not mean to let his uncle go. Nathaniel did not loosen the small hand. He sat in the firelight and watched his brother's son sleep and let himself feel, fully and without any ice at all, the thing he had spent 40 years refusing to feel: grief for Edmund, and love for Edmund's boy, and the plain unbearable tenderness of being trusted by a child who had every reason to trust no one. And he wept, once, quietly in the dark, the first tears he had shed since he was a boy at his mother's funeral, being taught by a cane that tears were not permitted at Blackmere. And no one saw and no cane fell, and the world did not end. He understood, wiping his face in the firelight, that he had been afraid of this his whole life. This, only this, the simple ordinary breaking of a heart that loved something it might lose, and that it was survivable after all, that people survived it every day, that the not feeling had cost him far more than the feeling ever could, and that his father had been wrong, wrong in everything, wrong for 30 years and beyond the grave, and that Nathaniel was free of him at last. In the morning he found Frances at the inn window, watching the gray light come up over the flat country toward the sea, and he came and stood beside her, and for a while neither spoke. Then he said, I owe you a great many things, Miss Thorne, and the first of them is the truth, which I withheld from you in that room when I had no right to. Will you let me give it to you now?" "You owe me nothing, your grace," she said, but she said it gently, and she did not move away, and he took it for leave. So he told her all of it plainly, as she herself told things, the forged letter and what it had threatened, and the cold trap Vane had built, and the reasoning by which he had persuaded himself that to send her away was the only shelter he could give her, and how wrong that reasoning had been, and how it had risen in him not from truth but from an old fear taught to him with a cane in this same cruel manner 30 years before, that to feel is to open a door through which pain comes, and that a man had better freeze than grieve. He told her of Edmund and of his father, and of the boy he had been at the schoolroom window. He told her that he had known from the first hour that the letter was a lie, that he had never for one instant believed her a thief, that the hardest part of the whole cold morning in the study had been to let her walk out believing he had believed it, that he had chosen her ruin in his own eyes over her ruin in the world's, thinking it a mercy, and had learned since that it was only cowardice wearing mercy's coat. "I told myself I sent you away to keep you safe," he said, "and there was a grain of truth in it enough to lie to myself with. But the whole truth, Miss Thorne, is that I have been afraid my entire life of the one thing that has ever done me any good, and when the moment came to be brave to stand beside you openly and fight the lie with the truth and dare the world to make it scandal, I reached instead for the ice, because the ice has always held me, and it held me that once too many, and it cost me the sight of your face when you left that room believing I thought you a thief. I would give a great deal to have that moment back. I cannot have it back, so I can only tell you now what I could not tell you then, that I never doubted you, that I have not, since the first day I saw you step in front of that cane, doubted you in anything, and that the reason I could not bear to keep you near me was not that I valued you too little to defend you before the world, but that I valued you too much, and was too great a coward to say so, even to myself." Frances was quiet a long time. The sea light came up gray and then, at the horizon, faintly gold. And then she said, without looking at him, "Do you know what was the hardest of it, your grace? It was not being called a thief. I have been ill-used in houses before. I have grown a thick enough skin for the world's opinion. It was that I had come in these weeks to think that you saw me, not the governess, me. And when you sent me off with those cold words I thought, I have been mistaken again. He never saw me at all. I was a fool to think a duke ever looks at a woman like me and sees anything but a servant grown inconvenient. That was the wound, not the lie. The thought that I had imagined the whole of it, the birds and the fire and the evenings and the way you—" She stopped. "The thought that I had imagined being seen." "You did not imagine it," said Nathaniel. "No," she said. "I begin to understand that I did not." And she turned from the window at last and looked up at him, and there was in her face the thing he had been most afraid he had killed in the study and now saw with a relief that unstrung him, had only been wounded and not slain, the warmth, the frank unfrightened warmth that had walked into his cold house and thawed it room by room and man by man until it reached at last the coldest room of all, which was himself. "I am not a duchess, your grace," she said quietly. "I am a clergyman's daughter with no fortune and no name and a character that a wicked man tried this week to take from me. Whatever you are about to say to me, and I think I know what you are about to say, for I am not a fool and you are not so cold as you pretend you should say it, knowing what the world will say back. It will say the Duke of Blackmere lost his head over his governess. It will never let either of us forget it." "Then let the world say it," said Nathaniel, "for once in its life the truth." And he took her hand the first time he realized that he had ever touched her in all these weeks, save to look at a bruise on the first day. Her hand was warm and work-roughened and steady in his, and he held it as though it were the only warm thing in a house made all of stone, which it was, which it had been from the beginning. "I have spent 40 years, Frances Thorne, making myself into a man of whom nothing was asked, and to whom nothing could be given because I was afraid, and I called the fear strength, and I was wrong. You have taught me that I was wrong. You and the boy between you have taught the cold Duke of Blackmere that a heart kept frozen is not saved, but only wasted. I will not waste what is left of mine. I love you. I have loved you, I think, since the morning I watched you teach a grieving child the names of the birds, though I had not then the courage to know it. I am asking you to be my wife. Not because I have lost my head, I have, if anything, found it for the first time in my life, but because I would rather be a warm man with you than a cold one without you, in a warm house instead of a frozen one, for whatever years are given me. The world may say what it likes. I have listened to the world for 40 years, and it has made me miserable. I should like, now, to listen to you instead. And Frances Thorne, who had stepped in front of a cane for a child not her own and asked nothing, who had been dismissed and slandered and had still spent her last hours guarding the boy, who had believed she had imagined being seen. Frances Thorne looked up at the Duke of Blackmere with the sea-light gold on her face and her eyes bright with tears she did not trouble to hide, and she said, "Yes, only that. Yes, Nathaniel." And it was the first time she had spoken his name, and he found that no one had spoken it kindly in so long that he had half forgotten it was his. And he raised her warm hand to his lips, and beyond the door they heard the boy wake and call out, not in terror this time, but in the ordinary morning voice of a child who wants his breakfast and his people, and the two of them went in to him together. They were married in the spring, in the small church that stood within the park at Blackmere, with the limes in new leaf and the fieldfares long since flown home to the north, and the swifts come back in their place. Nathaniel had wished for a great wedding, had wished, in a fierce new way that surprised him, to marry her before the whole county, so that no soul in the country should ever be able to say the Duke of Blackmere had hidden his bride or been ashamed of her station. But Frances had asked for a small one, among the people who loved them, and he had learned by then to listen to her, and so it was small, and it was the warmer for it. The boy stood up with his uncle. Mrs. Ashe wept. Cook wept. Mr. Prewitt, who did not weep, permitted himself to observe that it was the most satisfactory piece of business he had transacted in 50 years at the law, and drank 2 glasses of the wedding wine, which for Mr. Prewitt was an abandonment near to riot. The county said what the county had promised to say, at first, that the cold duke had lost his head, that a scheming governess had caught herself a dukedom, all the small cold things that small cold people say of any warmth that is larger than their own. Nathaniel heard it and did not care, and Frances heard it and cared less, and within a 12-month the county had largely given it up, for it is difficult to go on calling a woman scheming when she is forever in the poorest cottages with a basket, and forever kind to the very servants who might have been expected to resent her, and forever, plainly and visibly, loved. And it is impossible to go on calling a man cold when he is seen to laugh in his own park with his wife on his arm and his brother's son on his shoulders, and when the schoolroom at Blackmere, that had been the coldest room in a cold house, is now the warmest, with a good fire always in it, and the book of birds always open on the sill. As for the cruel ones, the world dealt with them as the world, now and then, will. Alaric Vane stood his trial at the assizes and was convicted upon evidence he could not answer, and the fine warm doors of England closed against him one after another as Nathaniel had foretold, and he ended his days, a shabby exile abroad on a small allowance. The Duke settled on him, for Nathaniel would not have even his enemy starve, having learned at last the difference between justice and cruelty, which his father never knew. And Mr. Silas Crowell, the tutor, who had thought himself so safe in the exercise of his little authority, found that a man dismissed without a character for laying a cane across a governess's back does not easily find another house to take him. And when it came out at the trial, as everything came out, that he had been Vane's paid instrument from the first, engaged not to teach the boy but to break him, no respectable family in 3 counties would have him near their children again. Nathaniel heard, a year or 2 on, that Crowell had been reduced to keeping a mean little day school in a manufacturing town, and had been turned out of even that when a parent discovered his history, and the Duke, told of it, was silent a while, and then said only that a man who lives by the cane will find, soon or late, that the world has a longer memory than he supposed, and that he hoped, without much expecting it, that Crowell had learned something. He did not gloat. He had a son now to teach what a man was, and gloating was not among the lessons. For the boy was his son. It was made so in law within the year, Thomas confirmed, upon the certified marriage lines, as the lawful son of Lord Edmund and therefore, after his uncle, the heir of Blackmere, and made so in every other way that mattered long before the law caught up to it. He ceased by degrees to be the grave, silent child who had held himself still to keep from being seen, and became a boy who ran and shouted and got into the ordinary scrapes of boyhood and knew, in the marrow of him, in the place where a child either does or does not know it, that he was not alone and would never be alone again. He called Frances Mamma before the wedding was a month old. She had not asked it, and neither had Nathaniel. The boy had simply, one evening by the fire, tried the word and looked up quickly to see whether it was allowed, and Frances had gathered him in without a word, and that had settled it. And he called Nathaniel uncle still, but in a voice so changed from the frightened one that had first named the Duke in the schoolroom that it was, in truth, another word altogether. There is a scene that Nathaniel came back to in the long, contented years that followed, more often than any other, a small thing of no consequence to anyone but him. It is an evening in the schoolroom some years on. There is a fire, a good one. Frances is reading aloud. She is always reading aloud. The house is never again without the sound of it, and the boy, grown longer-limbed now, is sprawled on the hearthrug with the book of birds, adding to it in his own hand a drawing of a swift, for he has his father's eye after all. And Nathaniel sits in the chair by the fire with a book he is not reading, watching the two of them, his wife and his son, in the warm room that was once the coldest in England. And Frances looks up from her page and catches him watching, and smiles, the same smile she gave the boy on the first day at the schoolroom door, the smile that transformed her whole tired face. And the Duke of Blackmere, who was once a cold man in a cold house and is now neither, smiles back at her across the firelight, and thinks that he was very nearly not here, that he came within a hair's breadth, within one more winter of the ice, of never knowing any of this, and that he owes the whole of it, his son and his wife and his own thawed and beating heart, to a brave and gentle woman who once, before she knew his name or he knew hers, stepped without a sound in front of a blow that was never meant for her. He never forgot it. He told her so often in the plain new way he had learned to say the things that once would have frozen in him unspoken, and she would say, in the same words she had used the very first day, that anyone would have done it, and he would answer as he had answered then, that no, they would not, that most of the world would have stood aside, and that she was the one soul in it who had not, and that he had spent the rest of his life being grateful, and meant to spend what remained of it the same way. And the fire would settle in the grate, as it had settled on the day it all began, and the warm house would hold them, and outside in the dark the great cold name of Blackmere, that had meant pride and hardness and cruelty for 4 generations, meant now, in the county's slow amended speech, only a place where a good woman lived and a hard man had been made kind, and a child once meant to be lost was safe, and loved, and home.